Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the morning show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, December 8th, 2017. Time for another show, though I have no idea what we're going to be doing. I think, so far, I haven't seen a word from Donald Trump. So we can't have a show unless Donald Trump is anger tweeting. And as you know, there's no topics to address other than the Orange Menace. But we'll find other ways to do it. As a matter of fact, the New York Times has found an interesting way of approaching the situation. This is really getting printed. In the New York Times opinion piece, I mean, this has captured my interest for the moment. People tweeting around a New York Times opinion piece that appears to run under the headline. I'll open it up here. But the tweet says, when Trump refers to himself in the third person, is he expressing not a personality disorder, but an intuitive grasp of the subtlest Buddhist teachings? That really got printed, apparently. So I don't know. I guess we'll have to take a look at this one. This is ready for their Sunday review. I can't believe that that's not a joke. But I don't know. We'll take a look and see if we can find out. Anyway, it reminds me a lot of another popular item circulating on Twitter right now, the video of our good friend, I guess, Chad Kroger. If you haven't met Chad, time to introduce him to you. He's the protagonist in the What Up Council video. If you haven't seen this thing, I highly recommend it to you. Maybe we'll circulate that in today's roundup thing, but it's difficult to tell whether that is just an elaborate joke, which I hope it is, or could possibly be real. A young 20-something bro approaching the LA Council about a proposal to apparently ban house parties in the Hollywood Hills. I don't know how exactly you can do that, but maybe it's a certain subclass of house parties that they can ban. And he's all upset about it because, of course, it's his introduction to manhood was, as he says, shotgunning a tall can of Bud Light in front of the entire water polo team. It's a very well acted farce, if not an actual look into everyday life in real life LA. Anyway, Daily Kos Radio, ready to go here. We are live, as Bill has reminded you, all the way from Portland, Maine. Kagro X, that's me, hi, says, yes, we may live in a hellhole and everything's effed up, but at least it's Friday. And Friday doesn't really do us any good anymore because the weekend is here and uncontrolled Donald Trump time, unsupervised time, begins probably sometime around sundown tonight, if there's any truth to the rumor that Jared and or Ivanka were ever babysitting the big man. I'm not certain that they ever were any help in that or anything else, but we will, I guess, see shortly. I mentioned to you, or Bill mentioned to you that, yes, America, of course, a gigantic hellhole. One of the other things that occupied my morning was the circulation of yet more newly unearthed video, this time of Roy Moore, essentially insisting, according to the Twitter summary of this video, and I don't know how long it is or whether it's easy to play on the air or not, and in fact, I probably should avoid doing it, but apparently Roy Moore says more or less in this video that Putin may be right. Maybe America is the focus of modern evil in the world, which is not an uncommon thing, for, believe it or not, for conservatives to say about the United States, usually in reference to, well, we're being taken over by, name your poison, the homosexual agenda, or for that matter, I don't know, immigrants or minorities of any stripe. It's a common complaint for them. And we've referred to it on this show as that weird phenomenon, which drives conservatives and Republicans to campaign on the platform that America is a hellhole, that there's something horribly wrong with the United States that, of course, only they can fix. So if you thought that was a new thing for Donald Trump's arrogance, for instance, to have insisted during the campaign that I alone can fix it. They all believe that. That's not just him. But, often they give credit to their fellow conservatives and say, well, we together can fix it by implementing ideas that are mine or the ones I agree with. But at any rate, this is not uncommon. It's been going on for a long time. And it kind of struck me just briefly this morning that, one, this is something we've seen before. And that he's sitting there saying, maybe Putin was right. Maybe America is the focus of modern evil. Paul Waldman put it well in tweeting this thing around, saying, by the way, remember when liberals said this Iraq war sounds like it might not be such a good idea? And conservatives responded with, why do you hate America? Right? Why do you hate our troops? Why do you hate America? And they were, of course, outraged when conservatives say, oh yeah, America may be a hellhole because of you and the things you like, which are actually, or the things you value, like, the things that make us actually strong and diverse and valuable. All of that, of course, is garbage. They want to go back to the olden days. And again, yesterday's outrage was Roy Moore video during which he says, he's questioned by what appears to be the sole African American in attendance at one of his campaign events. You say you like Trump want to make America great again. When was America last great? And he apparently gets around to answering that what he really means is prior to the Civil War, when we still had slavery, which is an amazing answer to give to anybody, but in particular to give to the sole African American attendee at your event. But, he blathers on to some extent about how, even though there was slavery, our families were together. We cared for one another. He says America was like unified behind a common purpose or something to that effect, which is an amazing thing to say about a country on the brink of civil war. It's as wrong as it could possibly get. We were together. We had direction. The direction was a gigantic war that threatened to tear the country apart forever over one of the most outrageous, immoral, I hesitate to even call it a policy just because it was so, okay. Well, you get the idea of that we were going to tear ourselves apart over the question of, and there was one side of the issue that actually stood there and said, yeah, slavery, great idea, fantastic. Not only great for us, but great for the slaves as well, because really, honestly, we hear even now when neo-Confederates tell us, well, they were much better off as slaves in America than free in Africa because Africa's terrible because, to their mind, I assume that they think Africa's terrible because it's full of black people and that to them is terrible. As opposed to, they're free and they have their own culture and that's actually two very good things. And enslavement is such a terrible one. It seems like such an easy comparison to me, but I guess they have difficulty processing it. Anyway, it occurred to me this morning that not only do they campaign almost always on the platform that America is a hellhole, but might as well bring up, this is a pretty opportune time to remind everybody that they're also, of course, the party that claims that they're full of patriots, that patriotism is their own sole province, and yet America is a hellhole. Our education system's going to hell because we took God out of it, or whatever it is. They always think America is falling apart. Of course, they're also the same people that have for decades insisted that they were the fiscal conservatives and they were the ones for fiscal responsibility and they were going to balance the budget and eliminate the debt. And you can't live with debt. Debt is crushing us. If you sit around with your family at the kitchen table, you can't deal with debt. You can't live on debt. Meanwhile, literally every time we put them in charge of anything, they blow up the deficit every time. And the liberals are tax and spending, and we always end up cleaning up the mess. And we end up imposing a lot of the austerity that they say they want to impose. It's interesting the way they are able to manipulate us into giving the country the medicine it needs to get better after they infect it every single time. we haven't seen, I don't know, and you and I have processed it, but America at large apparently still giving them a pass on that one. And in case they still didn't get the point, maybe it'll be easier to illustrate on this front. They're also, of course, the party that claims to be the party of family values. That fantastic buzz phrase has carried them a long way. Meanwhile, they have nominated, endorsed, and in the case of the presidency, elected a serial sex predator, and have nominated for the Senate a child molester, and it's all cool with them. They're fine with that, and I guess they're willing to accept that because family values, or more to the point, lots of people still think we're the party of family values. Lots of people still think we're the party of fiscal responsibility. Lots of people still think we're the party of patriotism and we love America. But it's a hellhole. We're all child molesters, and we are using reconciliation to add $1.5 trillion or maybe $2 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. But please, by all means, continue to believe all of those things that we told you were great about us. Well, it seems like it's time for a reevaluation, but I don't know how much help we're going to get in that from, let's say, the traditional media. They seem stuck on this idea and somehow willing to give people a pass on this idiocy. Well, anyway, I don't know. Who else? What else is next? I mean, I guess we could find out whether we think the New York Times as an institution doesn't necessarily deserve to be held to the standards of one particular wacko who thinks that Donald Trump is actually a Buddhist monk of some kind, a Zen master. Who is what are we talking about here? Ben Dolnick is the author of this piece. All I know about him is what it says at the bottom. He's the author, most recently anyway, of the forthcoming novel, The Ghost Notebooks, which tells me nothing. But okay. Anyway, I guess at the end here, maybe this is the only thing we need to read. The last paragraph just says this. Does this mean that Donald Trump, when he goes on and on about Donald Trump, quote, Donald Trump, is demonstrating his enlightenment? That when he refers to himself in the third person, he is expressing not a personality disorder, but an intuitive grasp of the subtlest Buddhist teachings? Ben highly doubts it. So, okay, you know what? Don't write that essay. I guess maybe unless it's a joke, I guess it could be a joke from top to bottom. And we've all been suckered by the headline, and that's kind of what it looks like. Well, I don't know. I guess I'm curious about that, but we could spend more time trying to figure it out, or just take the last paragraph for what it's worth and just say, yeah, that's about it. I mean, it looks like a joke to me, and someone will have to read it, scan it, and tell me whether it's a funny enough one to spend 10 minutes on the show. All right. What else is floating around out there that deserves mention? Well, there's plenty, of course. Once again, Donald Trump gets himself into there's a tweet for everything situation. Even though he is not tweeting this morning, it doesn't matter. Tweets will come back to bite him from years ago. Oh, I see. There is one morning tweet. He's on his way to another rally. Big crowd expected today in Pensacola, Florida for a Make America Great Again speech. We've done so much in so short a period of time and yet are planning to do so much more. See you there. Of course, he has done nothing and is going to have another rally about having done nothing, but insists that he's making America great again. The fact that he's still doing campaign-style rallies really, I guess, tells you all you need to know. Yesterday, all he did was, he did Pearl Harbor things yesterday, though he screwed up the FDR quote, but not too badly, so... Anyway, as you know, or as I mentioned, a tweet that comes back to bite him as he holds the White House Hanukkah party last night, I guess. And Yair Rosenberg tweeted this one out. A lot of people sharing this one, saying yesterday, tonight Trump is hosting the White House Hanukkah party. Hanukkah is next week, of course. In an early holiday miracle, though, this Trump tweet lasted for 6 years and came back to burn him. What are we talking about? His tweet from 2011 complaining that Barack Obama was hosting the White House Hanukkah celebration early. In fact, in this case, 2 weeks early. Why? Because Barack Obama wants to be on vacation in Hawaii in late December. Sad, he says. But of course, you know that Donald Trump will be nowhere near Washington, D.C. for either Hanukkah or Christmas, for that matter. He'll be spending his Christmas, I'm sure, at Mar-a-Lago. Sad, but once again, to no one's surprise, he holds himself to no standard but whatever the hell feels good right now. And, you know, that used to be a hippie thing. Dirty hippie bastard that he is. All right, moving on. Let's see. Also, reminder for those of you who either missed the show yesterday or just wanted a reminder today. Today begins the final meetings of the DNC's Unity Commission. Today and tomorrow, I believe, both at the Marriott Wardman Park Hotel. And it's Armando's intention, anyway, to be there for the Saturday portion of the meeting. And those of you who heard him yesterday will be excited by the prospect, perhaps if you are in the Washington, D.C. area, of attending along with him and sitting in on what's supposed to be an historic shout fest and seeing where things go from here. Will be very interesting, and it will be very interesting to watch along and hear commentary, perhaps a wrap-up of what he observed next week from Armando. Although if you're on your way there and you have more commentary to add, you're certainly welcome to do so. Thanks, Armando. Here's a story that I definitely wanted to make sure to share with you early on in today's show. Brian sent me some. Brian Brown, who tweets under the Twitter handle of this Brian Brown. In case you weren't sure which one, first of all, he is the Brian Brown that spells his Brian with a Y, and his Brown as well. The rest of you would do so. And the word this, of course, spelled in the traditional manner as well. This Brian Brown had this to share with me yesterday, a Washington Post story that I otherwise would have missed, and I would have been greatly saddened to have missed it, considering the subject. Surge in gun sales after Sandy Hook led to spike in accidental gun deaths, study says. In other words, an academic, or very nearly academic, confirmation of everything that I thought was going to happen post Sandy Hook with the big push for everybody to go out and get their new guns. Accidental gun deaths, gun injuries, what have you. I was pretty sure that people who were motivated to run out and buy guns because they were afraid they were going to be banned post Sandy Hook, good luck with that one, were either going to be new gun owners pushed into gun ownership by, I don't know what, fear of mass shootings, legitimate fear, but I don't know if it's the best response to it necessarily, or just plain bought into the hysteria fueled by the NRA, as they usually do after any mass shooting event or otherwise, other kind of gun trauma that we suffer here on a regular basis in the United States. The idea that those guns, or any guns, or all guns, would be banned, and so you better run out and get them now. So people were either buying their first guns or buying new and unfamiliar guns if they were already gun owners. And I wondered whether, if people were really buying them in the volume that the NRA was claiming, whether we wouldn't see a spike in accidents as people either unfamiliar with the weapon accidentally fired it, whether that hit somebody or not, or became daily concealed weapon carriers all of a sudden and just weren't used to the practice, figuring they would carry their concealed weapons with them and, be the good guy with a gun that stops a mass shooting for once and bullseyes that mass shooter in a dark theater or a crowded school or firing from the 36th floor of a Las Vegas hotel or what have you. And that has Hasn't happened yet, but I'm sure it will in the near future because reasons. And in the meantime, I was worried that the waiting game, waiting to be that hero, people would make mistakes along the way, and sure enough, they have. Of course, one of the other motivations that I had in starting Gun Fail was discussing how often people really do have these accidents, such that you would be able to have some basis on which to evaluate the wisdom of taking those either new gun owners or owners of new and unfamiliar guns, or those unfamiliar with daily concealed weapon carry, and putting them in every classroom, as was at one point suggested as the NRA's response to Sandy Hook. If teachers simply carried their guns into every classroom, around 25 to 30 wiggling elementary school students and overly curious and not quite yet socialized to the dangers of semi-automatic weaponry, these kids, wouldn't that be a fantastic idea? And would you have more accidents and injure and possibly kill more people waiting for the next school shooting to start? Would you, in fact, accidentally shoot more kids than you might lose in the next school shooting? I mean, it's rather cold calculus to have to make. But the question was America ready to really have guns lying around, or even strapped to the person of semi-trained individuals in every classroom in America all across the country? And would we pay a higher price in accidents? So this begins to look at that question. And of course, I began to look at that question, one, with an eye towards whether or not it was a good idea to arm teachers and put them in my kids' classrooms, and two, whether the accident rate that began to spike immediately following Sandy Hook was going to be a sustained trend. I initially thought that we were going to see an upsurge in these kinds of mistakes, especially when I began to see stories about people. There was a huge spike right afterwards in people forgetting their guns in bathrooms. That's leveled off somewhat, but it's still a very popular style of gun fail. And it became obvious that people who really weren't used to carrying a weapon day in, day out all the time were carrying them more often, and then finding that they didn't know what to do with them when they were utilizing public restroom facilities, and very quickly went into their usual post-use, let's say, routine, washing their hands and departing and leaving the guns behind. Although it became, I think, startlingly obvious that I needed to collect the stories on a regular basis when, on January 20th, 2013, declared by the NRA and other gun activists as Gun Appreciation Day, as part of the backlash to what they thought was going to be the anti-gun backlash following Sandy Hook. And they encouraged everybody to go out to the nearest gun store or gun show and become familiar and maybe buy a product or two while they were out there before getting banned. And with all those new and inexperienced hands out there handling the weaponry, and maybe not all that experienced hands handling the sales of the weaponry, 3 separate accidental shootings at three separate gun shows on Gun Appreciation Day, injuring, I think, by some counts, up 5 or 6 people in these 3 shootings. That also convinced me that this was something that was going to be a sustained problem and interesting enough to watch long term. So now we have some actual results here to share, although we are butting up against our first break. But, we'll have it overlap and jump the break and continue after that. Surge in gun sales after Sandy Hook led to spike in accidental gun deaths, study says. William Wan has written this one up for the Washington Post. In the days after the horrific shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, gun enthusiasts rushed to buy millions of firearms, driven by fears that the massacre would spark new gun legislation. Those restrictions never became a reality, but a new study concludes that all the additional guns caused a significant jump in accidental firearm deaths. And, deaths aren't, of course, the the only outcome from this, and they're just the worst. But plenty of people are injure themselves, injure others needlessly, and even in those reports, we've learned over the years how often people say, well, the child is expected to be fine, or the man is expected to make a full recovery. But we occasionally, but usually it's pretty rare, but we occasionally get a peek into what it takes to come back to making a full recovery or being fine as expected. The physical therapy involved, or the lifelong lingering wounds or health problems of, shoot yourself through the femur. It's a pretty big deal. You're expected to be fine, i.e. you don't have to be buried, but learning to walk again is no small thing. Or learning to write while you're a grade school student but have shot a hole in your right hand and you're not left-handed, for instance, and dealing with that, it's no small thing. But you're expected to be fine. We all expect you to be fine. That's our expectation for you. Please live up to it. Well, that poses some problems. Not to mention, I imagine, probably once in a while, some post-traumatic stress issues as well, but they're only very rarely discussed. And of course, I guess by way of delaying things in terms of the reading until after our big break, which is coming up, I would comment just briefly on the comment dropped out there in this lead paragraph, left all alone, and we glossed right over it. Remember that part about driven by the fears that the massacre would spark new gun legislation? Of course, that's kind of a groaner of a line. There have been legislative accomplishments since there in some states that have some gun sense, but elsewhere they've loosened restrictions everywhere, and since then we've only seemed to see an explosion in these things. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching Kagro X or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Trying to get a sense of whether or not that New York Times opinion piece was in fact a joke. I really sincerely hope so, although it would reveal our all too common tendency to read a headline and scream about it before reading the actual piece, but that one really feels like trolling, if nothing else. But I can't imagine that it doesn't come out looking like a joke. Anyway, as I was discussing before the break, actually more interested in this piece from the Washington Post about the surge in gun sales after Sandy Hook, leading to a spike in accidental gun deaths, and talking about the unfounded fear, I think, among gun enthusiasts that the massacre would spark new gun legislation. There were a few states that did tighten things up, and we thank them for their activity, and they've continued to keep their residents of these states with better gun sense than, let's say, generally speaking, the South and parts of the Mountain West as well, and Pacific Northwest, for that matter. And gosh, the Southwest, really, the West is in trouble when you think about it. Now, California, of course, the most populous part of it, has kept a lid on its guns, but the Pacific Northwest, notorious really in its loosening of gun laws, and it's happened all over the place. And for the most part, the reaction has been to loosen gun laws, probably on the nebulous theory that more good guys with guns out there would be ready to stop more of these bad crimes. But it seems to the rest of us like we've seen instead an explosion in the number of mass shootings and mass gun trauma incidents, as well as accidents, in the years since. And I've certainly observed that in gun fail. This year we're running record totals way, way ahead of all previous years. And I mean just the years since 2012, since the Sandy Hook massacre, that I've been watching these accidental gun deaths among children ages 14 and under. For whatever reason, that's sort of the demographics, the way they divide things. 14, I don't know why statisticians and others decide on that number, but they did. There's probably a really terrific reason for it, and a great procedural explainer show could be put together on it. I just don't know what it is. But you'll recall from being a longtime listener of the show that for whatever reason, gun enthusiasts were insisting that there was a small enough number of such accidents that it was an acceptable number to them, that it was okay by them that only about 60 children under the age of 15 were accidentally shot to death each year, except the reality is that even by some rather stringent standards, you could find, as I did, in the newspapers, searchable through Google News in any given year, 100 to 120. In other words, twice that rate, twice that claimed number of kids under the age of 15 accidentally being shot to death each year. And that wasn't even a thorough examination of the problem. The New York Times very shortly thereafter followed up with their own survey of the news and of, more formally, of coroners' offices around the country to try and figure out what the number was. And they found that, yeah, we were undercounting by something like 50%. This year, though, we're breaking all the records. And even by my own count standards, my own sort of scan of Google News, and that was really it. That's how unscientific this thing was turning up about 100, 120 kids under 15 accidentally shot to death each year. This year, we're at 100. We were at 130 or so before December began. So we're looking, and for a while, we were even tearing up that pace. There was, thankfully, for some reason, a lull in really much of September. It was kind of, August and September were kind of quiet in those terms and brought us a little closer to the regular pace, but we're still going to kind of smash that record. Anyway, of course, to update the situation in terms of how we doing on getting decent gun legislation. Most of you would have seen the headlines in the last couple of days that the first gun legislation to be addressed in Congress since the Las Vegas shooting was not, in fact, any sort of effort to control the sale or use of bump stocks, that those products that turn semi-automatic weapons easily into makeshift machine guns, but rather instead a concealed carry reciprocity scheme that would essentially allow anybody who is licensed to carry a concealed weapon in their home state to carry in any state in the union if it were to become law. And of course, there are now many states that make no requirements whatsoever of gun owners in order to become concealed carriers, and don't even require permits for the ownership of the gun in the first place. And so basically erasing all state law, even those states that decided to tighten things up after Sandy Hook or after, name your tragedy, they too would find all of their work nullified because states' rights, and leave it to the states when it comes to other stuff. But guns, everybody has to be able to do whatever the hell they feel like, because after all, there's really no inherent danger here. All right. So again, back to this Washington Post piece. This study, the study we're talking about, was published Thursday in the journal Science and estimates that the 3 million guns sold in the several months after Sandy Hook caused about 60 more accidental gun deaths than would have occurred otherwise. You'll have to see science for the exact methodology of their work, I guess. But the article continues, children were killed in a third of them, some 20 youngsters, the same number as died at Sandy Hook. We lost another Sandy Hook's worth entirely by accident in the several months following this spike in sales driven by the NRA. The work by two Wellesley College economists tackles one of the biggest questions in gun research: how to measure the relationship between gun prevalence and gun deaths. For decades, hamstrung by lack of funding and the politically charged landscape surrounding gun control, researchers have lacked data to try to answer that question. So that's why I tried to answer it for them. With no federal or state databases of gun ownership to work from, for example, researchers have struggled to definitively correlate deaths to the presence of guns in homes. They've grappled with what conditions would best determine the factors, gun sales, different state laws, the types of guns available, that might affect gun violence and death. By seizing on the surge of firearm purchases after the 2012 tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, the Wellesley team essentially set up an experimental model to study what happens after such a sudden increase in gun sales. And of course, we are coming up on the anniversary of the tragedy in Newtown. Of course, it'll be December 14th, mid next week. Is that Thursday? We'll have to remember to mark that. I'm sure Greg won't forget, and will give us that somber reminder. Neither of the two statisticians who conducted the research, Philip Levine and Robin McKnight, had worked on gun violence before. It's interesting that economists and statisticians would take this up. McKnight had mostly looked at health insurance issues, and Levine at such social policies as teen pregnancy. They launched their study after seeing a chart in a newspaper showing the sharp upturn in gun sales after Sandy Hook. It brought up so many questions, Levine said. Indeed, it brought those questions up in my mind, and I'm not even a Wellesley statistician. The two scrutinized weekly search data from Google, what a great methodology that is, which showed that terms like buy a gun increased fourfold as President Barack Obama began pushing for new gun restrictions. Using the number of background checks as their proxy, they found an increase in gun sales in the 4 months afterward. Then they compared that number to two databases of deaths nationwide, which showed a 27% increase in accidental gun deaths for all ages and a 64% increase among children during that period. The researchers attribute many of the deaths to improper or inadequate gun storage, which is, of course, a training issue, which is, of course, one of the first things eliminated as a requirement both for gun permitting and concealed carry permitting in the many states that loosened their gun laws in the days and months and years following Sandy Hook. But whatever, right? Back to the article. It also shows the unintended consequences of public policy. Said Levine, noting that it wasn't the shooting itself that caused an increase in gun sales and deaths, but the political debate over potential legislation. It suggests that in pursuing stronger restrictions, we have to consider the likelihood of actual legislation getting passed, because if it fails, there are short-term costs. That's a bit of a wrinkle on it, isn't it? Now, there's a chart here that sums most of it up here, just a graphic, but it's sort of striking. A new study, just summarizing the whole thing, finding that in the 4 months following a shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in the U.S., Google searches related to gun purchases increased 4 times, gun sales increased by 3 million, and accidental deaths related to guns increased by 20 among children and 40 among adults. So, continuing on toward the conclusion of the article, while the study is garnering interest, longtime gun researchers point to a major hole in the findings. The study found that accidental gun deaths increased, but the surge in gun sales had almost no effect on homicides and suicides that were intentionally committed, and that make up the lion's share of gun deaths in America. It's a serious and provocative study, but it's important to keep in mind that in the grand scheme of things, accidental deaths are relatively rare, said David M. Studdert, a professor at Stanford Law School. Suicides and homicides, that's the main game that researchers are trying to figure out when it comes to the causal relationships between guns and mortality, or rather the causal, not casual, but causal relationship, I should know that by now, between guns and mortality. And while true, the accidental rate was a primary concern for me. I mean, you can have that concern. I was pretty sure that that was going to be an obvious and inevitable result of what was happening, and it turns out to be true. And really, the families of the additional dead don't really care necessarily all that much that well, you can't what about them on that. Well, what about suicides? Well, what about them? I'm burying a family member. I don't want to do that for any reason. Anyway, it continues on here. It's a novel approach, and it will spark a lot of discussion and additional work, which is much needed, but I don't think this will be the final word, said Philip Cook, a leading gun policy expert at Duke University. One nagging point, he noted, is that while the spike in gun sales after Sandy Hook was significant, it only added a small amount of guns to the country's total gun stock. It's surprising that such a small increase in the overall gun stock could have such a large effect on one category, accidental deaths, and yet no effect on other categories, he said. It's not really surprising. I'll discuss why in a moment. Yet the study is part of a larger wave of renewed enthusiasm and new approaches being applied to gun research, Cook said. There's increased public attention and a sense that this is important, and it creates this snowballing effect. The political intensity around guns doesn't seem to be changing, but I feel hopeful about the future of research. And that's nice. I'll add this at the end. I am solely responsible for the entirety of this. How's that? Is that a big enough claim for everybody? I do feel like gun fail as an inquiry and as a pursuit, particularly the use of social media to promote it as an area of interest and an area of study, did a lot, I think, to change the way gun violence, gun incidents, guns accidents, etc., were covered in America. These child deaths, accidental child deaths, have always been with us. And I mean always, and in case that you weren't sure that they really honestly always were, because there was an effort at some point by gun enthusiasts and conservatives to insist that back when America was a real gun culture and everybody had guns and you were a Minuteman and that's why you had the guns in your house, this sort of thing didn't happen. And that's a myth. And Peter Manso did a terrific job in demonstrating exactly what a terrible and misguided myth it was in putting together his book, Melancholy Accidents, and reminding us that, they just had a different word for it then. They didn't have social media and hashtag gunfail to describe these incidents, but instead they had their own euphemism of melancholy accidents. And we're really talking about like from back in the colonial days on, there was a real fascination in publishing these stories, and there's a real record, easy enough to find if you're willing to do the research, if you're willing to go back to the old microfilm, etc., and take a look at the historical record as recorded by newspapers of the day. People have been accidentally shooting themselves. Kids have been accidentally shooting themselves and killing themselves since colonial times and all the way through ever since. We just, for some reason, either put it aside or forgot about it or treated them as isolated incidents. At most, it was a regional story when a child, even in modern times, found a weapon and accidentally shot themselves and died at home. You'd see a tragic story from out of XYZ regional city. Very rarely did it make national news, and it was probably because it was just sort of inherently recognized. Sure, this thing happens all the time. It's of interest because it's home news here in this area, but you don't put it on the national news when there's bigger, more important things to deal with. And so every one of these things became an isolated local/regional tragedy, but it wasn't until these numbers were being compiled, and we were able to tell you, a kid under the age of 15 accidentally shoots themselves to death twice a week or more in this country. This is happening all over the place. And if you look at it as a national problem, you would, I think, get a better idea of what the scope really was. And sure, it's a small part of gun mortality, but it's a far more preventable one. I mean, one of the claims that people make about the issue of gun suicides is that that's not preventable, that people will find a way to harm or kill themselves even if they're denied a gun to do it. And that's probably true, but guns are a hell of a lot more convenient and easy and make bad snap decision making a lot, make that decision making possible and deadly. The planning that has to go into most other methods of suicide gives people a built-in escape hatch, but only a moment of weakness is necessary to do it with as I refer to these to guns, a handheld instant death machine. It's quick and easy, and too many people use that as a way out for the pain that they're suffering, rather than being afforded at least a moment's reflection or thought in trying to figure out a different way of doing things. Anyway, I mentioned that I had a bone to pick with the penultimate paragraph in this piece. That one nagging point this Duke University gun researcher noted was that while the spike in gun sales after Sandy Hook was significant, it added only a small amount of guns to the country's total stock. So it's surprising that this small increase in the overall gun stock could have such a large effect on one category, accidental deaths, and yet no effect on other categories. And I think we explained it at the outset. The gun surge was either going into the hands of inexperienced gun owners or perhaps more experienced gun owners, but now experiencing a different weapon for the first time or a different mode of use, mode of carry than before. Lots of people had lots of guns. They kept them hopefully locked up in a gun safe at home. Maybe they were hunters, maybe they were target shooters and recreational shooters, but they mostly kept a stock of guns at home. What was really, I think, what really surged was the popularity of everyday carry, whether concealed or open. Remember that this also coincided with a push for more open carry laws or even looser concealed carry laws. And I think what you found was more people convinced, even experienced gun owners, convinced by the argument that they needed to be prepared on a moment's notice in public during everyday life to take down a shooter. And so people began literally just sticking their guns in the waistbands of their pants and going about their daily routine with them in case of ISIS attack or in case of, well, more likely maniac white guy attack. But, and as a result, they began having all kinds of accidents, including shooting themselves to death accidentally. There was a rash of not only bathroom forgettings of guns, but a rash of people having that problem or shooting themselves or dropping their weapons or otherwise losing them or accidentally discharging them or intentionally discharging them in movie theaters. After that weird rash of movie theater shootings, people just began, well, frankly, they began ignoring all the posted signs, which are supposed to control such things on private property. They began ignoring all the warnings and signs and bringing their guns with them to the movies because they were literally going to be the guy that bullseyed the shooter in a dark theater. Except they ended up becoming the theater shooters when they accidentally shot themselves or got involved in altercations. You know, you're being too loud during the previews, or turn off your cell phone, or I thought you just threw popcorn at me, so I'm going to shoot you. We had a couple of incidents like that. We had a couple of incidents of people dropping the guns that they brought with them because they stuck them in their pockets and sat down in folding movie theater seats and had them fall out and fall to the floor. Some discharged, some didn't. We had a guy, bring his gun to the theater in case of theater shooting and shoot somebody through the back of the seat. Fired a shot through the seat in front of them and wounded the person who was minding their own business, they would have been fine. But because the person sitting behind you decided that they were going to be the Rambo that stopped the theater shooter, in their preparation to do so, they actually became the theater shooter, and golly, that was really upsetting. And by the way, the responsible gun owners in question usually try to run out of the theater and throw the gun in the garbage and disappear into the crowd outside rather than face the consequences, because so responsible. Anyway, I thought this was worth bringing up and worth dedicating a significant portion of the show to, because I do feel like I drove a lot of this. I think a lot of reporters found a renewed interest in gun accidents and gun violence in general, and in reporting these things on a larger scale, even when they were still only reporting local stories about kids that accidentally shot themselves. I found more and more and more local newspapers at the end of their report noting, this is the 5th or 6th time this has happened in our state this year, or locally or regionally, or kids throughout the Northeast have done this, and kids in the Pacific Northwest have done that. And more and more, I found that they were paying attention to larger trends in this area, and it became a bigger and bigger story. And now we have several advocacy groups that do this work more regularly. And there's the Gun Violence Archive and the Trace now, a regular publication online of gun safety issues. And we have Moms Demand working nationally, and for a while the Bloomberg funded groups, Every Town for Gun Safety, and of course the local organic groups that grew up out of their local tragedies, like the Sandy Hook Promise folks, and elsewhere. So I think we've made great strides in it, and it's very interesting to see both the New York Times taking up their early, 2013 study of childhood accidental gun deaths, and now this one taking up the question of whether putting all those additional guns in additional hands was going to result in accidents. It wasn't going to likely spike homicides and suicides, because either there were already plenty of guns around for people to do those things, or because they didn't represent any significant departure from the way people were living their lives around guns. The suicide situation, you use what's around. And though there were more guns around, they were usually on the person of someone who was carrying them for protection. They weren't simply lying around to be picked up by people who were having suicidal thoughts. And, as for homicides, the homicide market was already well supplied. This was for people who were carrying guns for a very different reason, and a very new reason. The idea that you needed to be publicly armed at all times is kind of a new angle in the gun debate, whereas the idea that if you wanted to kill yourself, getting a gun was a pretty good idea and a decent way of doing it, that wasn't new. What we did see, though, was sort of a spike, at least in the reporting, of the number of gun range suicides. And that's interesting, too. The very practical, economic thinking dominating the suicidal crowd. They're not crazy. They just have a different idea of what they need to be doing with themselves. And they were very rational economic actors. I found it very interesting, this rash of gun range suicides with rented guns. And I suppose, there's a very weird economic way of looking at it. Now, why should I go out and spend $500 on a gun that I'm only going to use once, and I'm going to kill myself after? On the other hand, I thought, well, you're never going to face the credit card bills for it, so why not? In fact, buy yourself something fancy and, really go to town with it. But I found it kind of a weird thing. People were going to gun ranges with the idea of killing themselves, but they weren't gun owners. But they knew that you could borrow a gun or rent a gun at a gun range, and then you could have an easy suicide. And there was this weird rash of this happening around the country, and to the point where gun range managers and owners were changing policies, and nationwide were putting out new policies and saying, I'm not renting guns to anyone who's unaccompanied anymore. That was kind of a new thing, and they had to do it. They didn't really announce why they were doing it, but the reality was they were doing it because they were afraid of people coming to their gun range and using their gun stock to kill themselves. And, well, that creates a rather enormous problem. Plus, it closes the range for most of the day, and you lose money. But, I don't know, it was a very weird development, and it's just a weird economic happening, I guess, a weird economic phenomenon that I thought was somehow worth mentioning. Anyway, coming up on the second of our 3 breaks, and we have managed to stretch this particular story out, but this one is, of course, of personal importance to me. We do have much else to discuss, and we'll take all of those issues up. Well, we'll take some of those issues up and ignore others, and then complain about not having the time to get to them, or rather around the end of the show. Okay. Oh, yes. Before we take our break, there are, of course, many comments. Serena Blaze pointing out that I believe Mom's Demand is part of Everytown. That's true, and I haven't been able to keep the network and the various connections straight. I'm just not really a part of it, despite you would think that there would be some more interplay between what I was doing and what they were doing, but it never really materialized. And just as well, that left me to my own devices and left me independent and not having to worry about carrying any particular water for any part of anyone else's agenda. I could just sort of do my own thing. But yes, well worth pointing out. Chris Fry also pointing out for us that there was a school shooting yesterday. 2 students killed in a shooting in a New Mexico high school, according to authorities, and I did see that as it was happening yesterday and tweeted that one out. So once again, back to the school shooting situation, and just another day of gun tragedy in America. We'll soon forget about it, I'm sure. We'll be back after this second break. Back now from our second break. I almost forgot exactly how quickly that is over. Here, with more Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. A little bit of a weird Friday, having some difficulty focusing today, but I really did want to get to that gun article and, well, frankly, claim some credit for having driven this as an issue of interest for researchers and others, although the question of whether they ever saw a gun fail is a open one and a long shot at that. But as I said, I know that Peter Manso had said quite openly that the gun fail series was a part of the motivation for putting together his own book and looking at the problem from a historical perspective. Okay. There were a couple of tweet storms over the last couple of days to 1 week that I intended to share with you, and I'd like to get to now, though we are a few days past their provenance anyway. And one of them I mentioned to you the other day, and I guess now in the wake of the resignation of Al Franken, which everyone... a situation in which everyone has been referring to the idea of weaponized bad faith, perhaps, as a significant factor. And there's still a raging debate over whether or not he should have resigned. And in fact, as I saw earlier this morning, Republicans were so perturbed by the fact that the issue of Al Franken was taken away from them that Ben Shapiro, I think it was on Fox News insisting that, yeah, he's probably not even really resigning. It's all fake, and he's going to hang on and fight, even in the face of a chyron right beneath him that said, yeah, he actually announced his intention to resign. He was on there to advocate for the position that, no, he isn't. We can still talk about this. But on another front, the Trump-Russia front, weaponization of bad faith is a big issue and a big problem, everywhere. Brian Beutler, I had mentioned his tweet storm the other day. He was talking about, as I said, something slightly different, Trump-Russia. A perfect illustration, he said, of how modern political journalism conventions short-circuit when a political movement uses bad faith as a weapon. here discussing the issue of people involved in the Mueller investigation having expressed at some point negative views of Donald Trump, and that sort of being fanned into obvious and per se evidence of bias, therefore undermining the integrity and value of the Mueller investigation itself. It started with the dismissal of an FBI agent, or removal of an FBI agent from Mueller's team because of expressed and explicit anti-Trump views in texts during 2016. But they tried to move from there on to others on the basis of, for instance, this article in CNN, which is cited in the first of Beutler's tweets. Mueller attorney praised Yates as DOJ official, email shows. And this was like really something from nothing here. It was so bad that they didn't even really get something out of it. But the story was from earlier this week, Tuesday, the 5th. A lawyer on the special counsel team investigating Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election lavished praise on Sally Yates after her decision in January to defy President Donald Trump and not enforce his travel ban executive order, according to government emails published Tuesday by the conservative activist group Judicial Watch. They're usually in the middle of these sorts of fannings of nothing into something. I am so proud, Andrew Weissman, then a top prosecutor in the Justice Department's Criminal Division, wrote to then Acting Attorney General Yates after the move. And in awe, thank you so much. All my deepest respects. Earlier in the day, Yates had sent a letter to DOJ lawyers instructing them not to make legal arguments in defense of the executive order on immigration and refugees. She was fired soon after by Trump. Weissman, in June, joined special counsel Robert Mueller's office, which is investigating, well, you know what they're investigating. I don't need to tell you. The New York Times has described Weissman as a top lieutenant to Mueller in the investigation. Several other DOJ employees, including a National Security Division official, and 3 then U.S. attorneys also applauded Yates in emails sent to her after the decision. One longtime department lawyer went on to blast the Trump administration for, quote, such contempt for democratic values and the rule of law, unquote. Judicial Watch obtained the internal DOJ communications as part of a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. The tranche of nearly 400 pages of documents sent to and from Yates' accounts for much of her official email content in the why does it say that this way? The tranche of nearly 400 pages of documents sent to and from Yates' accounts for much of her official email content in the first 10 days of the Trump administration. Form, perhaps? I don't know. The brief period that she spent as acting attorney general before she was fired, and while Trump's nominee, Jeff Sessions, faced Senate confirmation. The Weissman email comes amid renewed scrutiny of the special counsel team. The FBI acknowledged over the weekend that one of its chief counterintelligence experts who had been serving in Mueller's office, Peter Strzok, I don't know how he says that, Strzok, was removed from the team over the summer after an investigation found that he had sent text messages that could be seen as having an anti-Trump bias. That's it. In one email forwarded to Yates, the chief of staff to former FBI Director James Comey wrote to DOJ officials about a meeting Trump had requested later that day with the agencies that had participated in security for the inaugural activities. The director has been asked to represent the FBI, and he will attend along with Paul Abate, wrote the chief of staff James Rabicki. Abate is the assistant director in charge of the FBI's Washington field office. It was at that ceremony on January 22nd in the Blue Room of the White House where Comey, as he later told a friend, tried to blend into the curtains, remember that, to avoid notice by the president. Trump, in fact, called Comey over across the room for a hug as the cameras rolled, chiding him for becoming, quote, more famous than me. Comey was disgusted by the episode, which he thought was an attempt to compromise him in public. His friend Benjamin Wittes wrote earlier this year. Another document released Tuesday, a DOJ planning spreadsheet from January for upcoming sensitive or high-profile matters, includes an overview of communications between the DOJ and Michael Flynn, the president's former national security advisor, now outed as a notorious spy, who pleaded guilty last week to lying to the FBI. The overview in the document states that the DOJ had, on November 30th, 2016, requested information from Flynn and his private sector intelligence firm after press reports linked him to officials acting on behalf of Turkey's government. An attorney for Flynn responded to the DOJ on January 11, 2017, advising that Flynn and his firm would probably register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which could happen immediately and would be public. According to the document, in March, weeks after Flynn resigned for lying to the vice president, that's why he resigned, about his conversations with the Russian ambassador, the White House acknowledged it was aware of Flynn's unregistered foreign lobbying during the transition period. Yates, now a distinguished lecturer at Georgetown University's School of Law, has been critical of the administration since her firing. The email informing her that her termination is included in Tuesday's document dump. It was short. I am informing you that the president has removed you from the office of Deputy Attorney General of the United States, says the notice of removal sent by John DeStefano, assistant to the president and director, presidential personnel, at 10:16 p.m., on January 30th. So, what was it Brian was saying? He was saying, this is a perfect illustration of how modern political journalism conventions short circuit when a political movement uses bad faith as a weapon. What does he mean? Andrew Weissman, he says, did nothing wrong or even ill-advised. He praised the colleague who had just made what he thought was the toughest call of her career and standing on principle. The emails Judicial Watch obtained are important, but they're important as part of a larger story on the conservative movement grasping at straws to pull down the Mueller investigation. Before it became an existential threat to the Trump presidency, nobody with any credibility outside the administration had anything other than praise for the qualified team Mueller had assembled, and indeed for Mueller himself, I would say. The unspoken premise of the strange, new, insincere criticism is that Republican political figures must only be investigated by members of their own party. Robert Mueller, of course, is a member of that party, but never mind all of that. Needless to say, none of the bad faith actors here believed that in the 1990s, or probably at any time until Trump became president. And Mueller is, of course, he notes, a Republican. So a good point, well taken there, and another illustration of the problem of weaponized bad faith. Even more so than the one we witnessed in the past week, or the one we think we may have witnessed in the past week, if in fact there is something slightly different about the Al Franken accusations, and if in fact those things are that not all of them may actually be as we understand them. I mean, it is weird, and Al Franken got a lot of flack, and perhaps deservedly so, for not simply owning up to everything in his resignation speech. It seems clear, though, that to his mind, things aren't as we understand them, and that could mean one of two things. One thing, which a lot of people are clinging to as a hope, is the accusations aren't actually true. I have a hard time adhering to that one, particularly of late in the wake of Tina DuPoy's revelations as well. But I didn't have as difficult a time considering it when it was just one accuser, and B, an accuser that people were raising doubts about motivations for. That was kind of a weird situation. But it was hard it was just hard as a matter of principle to ignore accusations being made about somebody just because you thought they were either politically close to you or particularly smart person. That's not really a good reason to disbelieve accusations, and it made things very tough. But the fact that he continues to insist that there's something not right at best about these accusations makes me worry. Because one of the other things that's a possibility is, and this is one of the inherent problems surrounding this issue, is that maybe it's not that things were different from how they were described by the victims, but that they were perceived as different, but only by the men in the situation, which is the whole problem in the first place. So not a whole lot of room. I mean, 50% of the field is closed off to us here in terms of defense of the man. And so that's why it ends up being the right thing to do. And frankly, if you really want to consider that it's still just a setup, it may still be the right thing to do. And Al Franken takes one for the team and says, listen, there's really one side in all of this that takes it seriously, and one side that not only doesn't take it seriously, but thrives on it, and thrives on rubbing it in your face that they thrive on it. And you have to make a clear decision. If you care about sexual harassment as an issue, there is only one party that will help you, and it's better for everyone, perhaps, if in the long run that's recognized, understood, and reflected at the polls. And if it happens at the cost of Al Franken's personal grasp on political power, then so be it. And that may be what convinced him in the end. I don't really know what the motivations are. I suppose we'll probably find out more about it in the future. On the other hand, I would, I'll lay out for you this warning. As we said at the top of the show, everyone should know by now that the claim that the Republican Party is the one of fiscal responsibility is upside down, but they don't. Everyone should know by now that the claim that the Republican Party is the one that stands for family values is upside down, but they don't. Everyone should know by now that the Republican claim that they're the patriots who truly love the country is upside down, but they don't. So with that in mind, how much hope can we really hold out that even if we illustrate it right before America's collective face, that there is only one party that's concerned with this as a serious issue, and the idea that Republicans ever would or could do anything but revel in the fact that they refuse to acknowledge it as an issue should be clear to everyone. But will it be? Well, in the face of the track record on 3 other major issues of the day, I don't think that there's a lot of hope to be had in that. But hope springs eternal, and you got to do what you got to do if you want to stand for some certain principle as a party. So anyway, that's out there. Something big to consider for the weekend. There's more. I have more, in case you were wondering. Another tweet storm, this one from David Roberts, Dr. Vox. Looks like Dr. Vox. He's not a doctor. It's Dr. Dave Roberts. And when he was with Grist, he used to be Dr. Grist, and now he's with Vox, and he's Dr. Vox. And you know how much we love Vox. I tease Vox. I kid Vox. I love you. You're fantastic. But every once in a while, I think earlier in this, was it like Monday of this week, there was, I can't even remember what it was, but Ezra Klein tweeting something around like, here's the Vox story on XYZ. And it was like, yeah, we heard that like several days ago. Once again, Vox, my favorite source for stuff that my Twitter feed taught me a couple days earlier. Anyway, one of the good guys, they're all good guys, all good people at Vox. I love, they're very thorough. We'll put it that way. But Dave Roberts had this one. I thought this was a good thinker for the week. And it's true. We won't need any convincing. You'll nod your head and say, yes, yes, we need some of those too. So somebody threaded this or put this thread thing together, not in Storify, as Greg usually uses, but Threadreader, threadreaderapp.com. And there's a couple of apps out there that now make it easy to put those threads together. And this one is really interesting, I thought. A note, he says, on the politics of this tax bill, which is so absurd and horrendous, it can scarcely be believed. Like, really. And we'll talk, perhaps, if we have extra time, about some of the newer revelations about how horrible this thing really is. But he says, so absurd and horrendous, it can scarcely be believed. Like, really, as in literally true. Here we go. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, to throw things way back, George W. Bush and the Republicans put together an economic stimulus bill in response. Remember it? It was, brace yourself, 1, a huge tax giveaway to the rich, so grotesque a giveaway to the rich that even the Wall Street Journal acknowledged it as much, by the way. Paul Krugman wrote about this giveaway to the rich. It was so extreme that when political consultants tried to get reactions from voters and focus groups, the voters refused to believe what they were describing was actually an accurate description of the bill. That, according to a piece he posted in the New York Times back on December 21st of 2001. Voters refused to believe. Remember that. Now, fast forward to 2012 and the Romney-Ryan tax plan, which would have, brace yourself, slashed social spending to pay for giant tax cuts for the rich. Priorities USA, a Democratic super PAC at the time, ran focus groups on it. Here's what happened. I bet you can guess. When Priorities informed a focus group that Romney supported the Ryan budget plan and thus championed, quote, ending Medicare as we know it, while also advocating tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, respondents simply refused to believe that any politician would do such a thing. Again, when GOP economic policy is accurately explained to voters, they simply cannot believe it's true. And there's a citation here to a New York Times piece of July 8th, 2012, to back that whole situation up. Lots of people have used this as a kind of punchline, but I, in this case David Roberts, think it's worth taking some time to think about it seriously. Most people have other priorities and are woefully ignorant about politics. Research has confirmed this again and again. Boundless ignorance. And you hate to use the word ignorance, but, well, it drives the point home pretty well, I think. Average people absorb politics piecemeal, through osmosis, he says. What they generally see is a haze of pettiness, squabbles, and conflict. That sounds familiar, right? Viewed from this distance, most people conclude that politics is hopeless. All politicians are venal, and the whole game is corrupt. And by the way, I should add at this point that there are plenty of pundits who are willing to help drive this feeling. And I mean, the both sidesers that are out there, and you know, lots of names that you could suggest for that. If you are only absorbing your politics piecemeal through osmosis and are generally inclined to see only a haze of pettiness, squabbles, and conflict, there are professional pundits who you can absorb piecemeal and through osmosis that will entirely justify that point of view and promise you that you're correct. Some will then go on to say that the cure for this is somehow gathering politicians in a third camp. I don't know why that's the case, but you can find all the justification you need very easily, very prominently displayed. If you look no further than the surface, almost assuredly the only thing you will find is professional punditry telling you you're right, they all suck, a pox on both their houses, etc. So, unless you are willing to put in serious time and work, he continues, to suss out the details, pox on both your houses is kind of the default destination, and it's reinforced daily, I would add. So, when voters are confronted by the idea that one party wants to take from the poor and the sick to fund tax cuts for the rich, and another party doesn't, the other one, that simply doesn't fit the hazy both sides suck model. It sounds like an unfair partisan attack. Now, the truth, what we're saying here is the truth about the Republican Party sounds like an attack on the Republican Party. So people dismiss it as such. It is a perverse form of immunity. And here we come to the true twisted genius of the decades-long right-wing strategy. They have fractured trust in mainstream institutions, so there is no widely trusted person or institution who can tell the truth about the Republicans in a way that will be broadly accepted. There are no more trusted referees or arbiters. So the media atmosphere is filled with both sides yelling with no way to resolve. Now he puts it this way. It's filled with, quote, both sides, unquote, yelling. That is to say, it's filled with pundits yelling both sides. But also, it's worth noting, the media atmosphere is filled with, quote, both sides yelling, unquote, with no way to resolve. That is, both sides are yelling. That's what I see personally. And there's plenty of yelling from pundits that say, well, both sides. And that's the top line of what you're going to get. If, say, you do something dumb, like read only the headline of an article and draw a conclusion from that, right? Huge mistake. I made it earlier in the show, I think. Anyway, so here we are. No more trusted referees or arbiters. The media is filled with both sides yelling and no way to resolve it. In that atmosphere, everyone can just comfortably believe whoever is saying good things about their side. And we find ourselves trapped in one of the epistemological bubbles, once again. Which brings us to this current tax bill, which is even more comically malign and grasping than past GOP budget plans. Any attempt to accurately describe it sounds, he says, like an effing comic book villain revealing their evil plot toward the end of the movie. But it is surrounded in the media atmosphere by the exact same haze of both sides' charge and countercharge as ever. So your average citizen just going on instinctual heuristics isn't going to believe an accurate description of what's in the bill. It sounds too ludicrous. An accurate and horrific description sounds like what one side says. And we all know the truth is always in the middle somewhere, right? So in this way, the GOP, whether through design or accident, has stumbled on a brilliant political strategy for advancing kleptocracy. They exploit public and media heuristics that make us highly averse to asymmetry. They exploit the folk wisdom of both sides do it. They do their deeds now right out in the open, trusting accurately that a good chunk of the public just won't believe it is what it is. Journalists understand the model of finding and exposing hidden information, the pre-internet age core of journalism, but they have not yet solved the dilemma of how to help the public focus on and understand already public information that is surrounded by a fog of misinformation, BS, and distraction. This ludicrous tax bill is a real-time test case. Can the media convey that it really is as cruel and plutocratic as Democratic critics are saying it is? Can they convey that the Republican Party has become something more unhinged and venal than even its worst critics charge? I doubt it. I'm not sure there's any economic policy that could break through. Remember, respondents simply refused to believe any politician would do such a thing. That's the quote from the focus group. And that's how they get away with it. And that's how the tweet storm ends. I thought that was rather insightful and probably true and quite distressing, but something you needed to hear at some point, and for no other reason than to say, yes, that really is something. Now, how do we deal with that? Well, I have no ready answer for you, but we better come up with an answer and come up with it quick, because the more they look at this tax bill, not only are there, of course, procedural issues that are being raised by their rush to judgment, and although they didn't arrive at anything close to judgment, but their rush certainly, and the poor drafting that has left them with an amazingly huge problem in terms of like missing the mark on the essentially on the budget by like possibly as much as $1 trillion or more, which is really a rather amazing amount to miss with on your math guess. But they're finding more and more ridiculousness buried intentionally in the tax bill. And it's just, I mean, at this point, piling on, not likely to make anybody, it can't, what could it possibly do to cure the problem of already not believing that this could possibly be true? No politician would do it because it would be instant political death, and yet it isn't. I don't know. Well, we'll be back with the last segment after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio for our final segment, heading into the end of the Friday show and then into the weekend. Still plenty to get to. There's just so much with and every one of these pieces that we put aside requires such in-depth discussion. Well, that's what the show is all about. For me, anyway. Hopefully you enjoy it as well. I mentioned to you that there was yet more analysis on the tax bill and just how ludicrous it was, in addition to being awfully cruel and venal, and as Dave Roberts said, grubbing and whatnot. To no one's surprise, the New York Times has this piece. They find in their analysis that the tax plan crowns a big winner, and the answer is really Donald Trump and Trump's industry, and of course his son-in-law's industry as well. Nobody makes out quite as well in this as real estate investors do. And surprise, surprise, like we said early on, this thing was designed as though Donald Trump had said to his accountants, what's your fantasy for me? How do I erase my tax liability and in fact get the government to pay me additional money? And they said, well, I mean, I guess if you can do anything, you would do this. Now, I don't know what kind of pipeline Trump had to the tax bill writers and all this. And there's no particular reason to believe that they cared to do Donald Trump any personal favors in all this, except, I don't know, maybe it's all been a smokescreen. The bad relationship between the Senate Republican leadership and the president. They seem to roll over for him quite a lot. And maybe they figured, well, as long as we're cutting taxes and we get some of our own favorite breaks in there, who cares? Why not throw the president a bone here? The worse we are, the better off the worse we are to others, the better off we are ourselves, as Dave Roberts just illustrated for us. We can do anything we want. So what do you want? We might as well curry some favor with you on this one. Patricia Cohen and Jesse Drucker wrote this piece also from earlier in the week, the 5th. After a frenzy of congressional action to rewrite the tax code, sales clerks and chief executives are calculating their gains. Business was treated with the everyone's a winner approach that ensures no summer camper goes home without a trophy. Everyone gets a participation trophy. They hate those things, remember? Except, of course, when they don't. Some got special prizes. Cruise lines, craft beer and wine producers, even foreign ones, car dealers, private equity, and oil and gas pipeline managers did particularly well. And perhaps the biggest winner in the industry where President Trump and I guess is what it really should say, President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, where they make their millions. I see why they say now, where? Commercial real estate. That was a terribly mangled sentence now. So again, perhaps the biggest winner in the industry where President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, made their millions, commercial real estate. Got it? House and Senate Republicans, in their divergent bills, both offered steeply reduced rates to corporate giants, partnerships, and family-owned firms across the board. But when it came time to eliminate special tax breaks or impose tighter standards, real estate was generally excused from the room. Most businesses were hit with new limits on deductions for interest payments, but not real estate. Most industries lost the ability to defer taxes on the exchange of similar kinds of property, but not real estate. Domestic manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies lost some industry-specific breaks, like the tax credit for so-called orphan drugs, in exchange for lower rates. The real estate industry ended up with an even more generous depreciation timetable, allowing owners to shelter more income. And In a break from previous practice, rental and mortgage interest income qualifies for a lower tax rate, the kind of special treatment traditionally reserved for long-term capital gains and certain qualified dividends. So once again, by the way, a sop to those who make their money without any actual work. They just are gaining from ownership rights, but in particular, they get an even better treatment in real estate than anybody else. Real estate does great, said Daniel N. Shaviro, a professor of taxation at New York University Law School, who as a congressional staff member helped write the 1986 tax overhaul. It's hard to imagine what they might have asked for that they don't have. Real estate investment trusts, known as, I don't know whether they say REITs or REITs or REIT, known as REITs, let's say, have extra cause for celebration. They are companies that make money by owning, financing, and operating real estate. Sounds familiar, right? Both the Trump Organization and Kushner companies, the family real estate firm partly owned by Mr. Kushner, that would be Jared, not his dad, but his dad owns part of it too, and he's a convicted felon, have important deals with such trusts. A REIT or REIT functions like a mutual fund. But instead of assembling a portfolio of stocks, it allows people to invest in a bundle of real estate assets, both buildings and mortgages. More importantly is the way they are taxed. They pay no separate business tax and are instead required to pass along virtually all of their taxable income to shareholders who pay the tax when they file individual returns. The Republican proposals sharply lower the top tax rate on income that REITs and other business pass-through businesses pass through to their owners and shareholders. Currently, those investors must pay taxes on that income at rates as high as 39.6%. Under the Senate provision, it would drop to 29.6%. The House bill drops the rate even lower, to 25%. That's a big savings and a big advantage. Those receiving mortgage interest income outside a REIT would have to pay taxes based on ordinary rates. The Trump Organization is a partner in two of its largest properties with Vornado Realty Trust, a REIT based in New York City. In January, the White House appointed Vornado's founder and chairman, Stephen Roth, to develop a $1 trillion infrastructure package as a leader of an advisory council that has since been abandoned. Vornado has also been associated with Kushner companies, helping bail out its stake in 666 Fifth Avenue, the Kushners' flagship property, when it was in danger of defaulting on a more than $1 billion loan. Kushner Companies has teamed up with another New York-based REIT, SL Green Realty Corporation, in several deals. They are collaborating on a development in Brooklyn, and SL Green lent Mr. Kushner's firm $85 million in 2016 to refinance its slice of the former headquarters of the New York Times in Manhattan. A Kushner company spokeswoman said the firm had not done any lobbying on the tax bill. Kurt Kogel, a partner at the national accounting firm Marcum, noted that a lower corporate tax rate would enable other kinds of companies to better compete with REITs. But REITs are favored in other ways. Individuals who borrow money to invest in a REIT will be able to deduct the interest they pay on the loan at the top individual rate. When it comes to paying taxes on the interest income they earn from that REIT investment, however, the new lower pass-through rate would apply. That's a great deal, and it's going to create giant new tax shelters, said Stephen M. Rosenthal, a tax expert at the Nonpartisan Tax Policy Center. That's what you want to do with tax reforms, right? Create giant new shelters. Usually that's for eliminating those sorts of loopholes, but not this time. The tax code generally tries to prohibit this kind of rare tax rate, it's not rare at all, this kind of tax rate arbitrage, he added. The rate advantage is one example of a broader issue, different tax treatment for similar activities. Writers of the congressional bills promised that their overhaul would simplify the tax code, but the intricacies of the changes create countless opportunities for gamesmanship. Suddenly, there are a dozen different tax rates that apply to different businesses in different industries and to different investments, said Adam Looney, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a former Treasury Department official. That means opportunities to come out ahead by making deals between these different groups or structuring businesses to take advantage of various provisions. That could lead to a flurry of restructuring and asset shifting that has no purpose other than lowering the tax rate. One business might borrow money to invest in another, or buy equipment and treat it as an expense and then lease it to another company. Ideally, the tax code is meant to encourage businesses to make sound economic decisions and forego activities whose sole purpose is to avoid taxes. But the proliferation of different business rates rewards loophole hunting and earnings shifting. The speed with which they're doing this creates a level of ambiguity that will keep tax lawyers and tax professionals busy for 20 years, said Scott Michael, a tax lawyer with Kaplan and Drysdale. For some industries, such accounting acrobatics may not be necessary. A Senate provision that is being marketed as an aid to small craft breweries would save money even for the largest beer, wine, and liquor producers, whether they're in the United States or abroad. Foreign cruise lines that operate in the United States got a last-minute reprieve from a new tax that was in an earlier version of the Senate bill. Whistleblowers and their attorneys are happy about a provision specifying that they can collect rewards based on criminal fines. Car dealers escaped the cap on interest deductions that apply to most other businesses. Private equity firms were not able to sidestep that cap, but they held on to most of the carried interest benefit that allows private equity managers, hedge fund managers, and real estate investors to pay a lower rate on much of their income. That, of course, by the way, just as an aside, was a big campaign promise from Donald Trump that they were going to get rid of that private equity firm and hedge fund managers carried interest benefit because he was, as in his words, getting away with murder from that provision. Promise made, but promise broken. Even as one of the only tweets that Trump has made in the last 24 hours was trumpeting his own ability to fulfill campaign promises that other presidents had broken. I know he meant it in with respect to the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem. I don't know if that's what he was getting at in the tweet I saw this morning that included a video clip of Bill Clinton, but I would not be surprised if it were the same one. I keep my promises, except for the one on taxes, which you told us you were the only one who could fix this stuff. And then you came to town and didn't fix it. But you're a big promise keeper. Anyway, so yes, car dealers escaped their cap on interest deductions. Private equity firms kept their carried interest benefit. Firms will have to hold an asset for 3 years instead of 1, but on average, hold time is already more than 5 years, so no big deal there. The energy industry also did well. Coal and natural gas would potentially benefit from provisions that undercut their renewable energy competitors. Great. In a reversal of more than 4 decades of national policy, the Senate bill would open a pristine 1.5 million acre expanse of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas exploration. And at the last minute, the Senate bill gave master limited partnerships, which mainly finance pipelines, the same special tax treatment that REITs have, a lower rate on the income they generate. House and Senate Republicans are still wrangling over the final version, and every comma is subject to change, but to some tax experts, an unlevel playing field that gives certain types of businesses and structures advantages over others is a bigger concern than a tax break for real estate or any other industry. Remember, of course, we don't like to pick winners and losers in all of this. Well, that's all this bill does. And guess who the winners are? It ain't you. It's easy to look at the deals that are explicitly in the bill, like the special treatment of auto dealer financing or whistleblowers, and call out loophole, Mr. Looney of Brookings said. I love it, Mr. Looney. But the big problems are the things that aren't specifically noted in the bill, but will arise because of tax planning. But of course, that was all the idea, really, basically, of putting this whole thing together. And one thing that I didn't see mentioned, but I have curious, I'm a little curious about. Remember the reporting, the writing of Mark Sumner over at Daily Kos earlier in the year about the frequency with which Donald Trump was still visiting his own properties, and the question of whether he was still visiting them, not just to promote his brand name in the public eye, but to possibly remain eligible to claim certain specific tax benefits which are available to so-called real estate professionals who have to spend the majority of their time under current tax rules in handling their real estate investments as a profession in order to qualify. That was going to be extraordinarily difficult to continue to do if you were holding, a part-time job like President of the United States. But of course, somehow he not only made it possible, but made us pay for it along the way. Now he doesn't even have to pay for his own plane rides to visit his properties. We take care of that for him. It'll be interesting to see whether he continues to claim those benefits. And it'll be an open question as to whether or not you ever get a chance to find out whether he's still claiming those deductions and those benefits, because you'll never see the man's taxes. That was reiterated just the other day when the White House said, all presidents' returns are routinely audited, and so therefore he'll still be under audit and still can't release his taxes to you, all of which was nonsense to begin with, but they re-upped on it anyway. All right. Wow. What a amazing situation. But not surprising, just amazing to hear it laid out that way. All right. There's still lots to get to. However, I did make specific mention of the oil and gas industry, and I have one other listener contribution, which I think perhaps we'll use to carry us almost to the end of the show. A friend of yours and mine on Twitter and on Daily Kos, Peace Arena, who also goes by Serena Blaze, and we were puzzling that out on our own. Peace Arena. Oh yes, I get it now. Actually sent us a piece on the fracking industry and the damage it's doing, of course, in Oklahoma and elsewhere, and the efforts that locals are making to push back on it. And it's really kind of interesting. Now, for whatever reason, I wasn't able to get it to plug into my soundboard, but I think I should be able to just play it for you straight from the file and have Loopback capture that. I'll keep an eye on things and make sure that it's getting through. But very interesting perspective on the issues there. And, of course, you've heard all about the quakes and worrisomes. Let me roll it here because we're getting close to the end of the show. Thanks, Serena, for sending for us and helping us out, helping us fill our 2 hours here today. Take it away, please. You know what? I don't think this is going through here correctly. I got to find a way to make this work a little bit better. I think you can probably hear it, but only because the output is being heard over my speakers. Is there any way to do this? I might have to delay this until I can make it work properly inside of Soundboard. I haven't figured out exactly why I have been unable to play it, but I have lots of backup plans. And Serena, we'll give it another shot, I think on Monday or early on in the week, perhaps Tuesday when there are no other guests scheduled. But we'll give it a shot on Monday. I appreciate your sending it to me, and I think you'll be happy with the results here too. Since I was trying to condense things a little bit, it's nicely cleaned up and well edited, and all the content is in there. But all of the mistakes I make with live reads and ums and ahs, I've smoothed it all out. So it sounds very good and runs about just over, I guess, 8.5 minutes rather than the original 9, so slimmed it down a little bit too. But thank you for sending it to us. I don't know why it won't plug into my soundboard that will guarantee that I can get good quality sound out over the stream, but I'll figure it out, or figure out a near substitute that'll work by the beginning of next week. Okay, thanks again. And yes, you got the, obviously you did get the email address right. And I remind all the rest of you that it's an easy thing to do. If you find an article that you think needs coverage, or you write an article that you think needs coverage and we're just not getting to it to your satisfaction, or you have a specific point that you want to make in your own unique way, sit down with your smartphone or other electronic recording device, make a file of it and email it. That's the easiest thing you can do. Kagro in the morning on KagroX. You can find me that way on Gmail. Find me on Twitter and let me know, and we'll remind you of the address, but it's as simple as can be. KagroX, KAGROX @gmail.com, and attach that file, and we'll see what we can do about finding space to include it in our show. And we thank everybody who makes those contributions, and of course the financial contributions that keep us running. Thanks so much for all of those as well. Yes, I'd like to be able to remind you daily during the third break, hopefully by the beginning of next week, of how easy it is and just how you can make a recorded contribution to the show, in addition to the monetary contributions we keep badgering you for, but that are so necessary. Okay, so let's see. Other things that we probably could shoehorn in on short notice. I noticed that Jamil Smith had made an interesting point on Twitter that we ought to get in before the weekend, noting if he wins on Tuesday, Roy Moore can partly thank the Shelby County v. Holder decision. Voter suppression will play a big role in Alabama's special election for the U.S. Senate. And 5/5, our good friend Van Newkirk, who writes as 5/5 on Twitter, is right to note that we aren't talking enough about it. And he's got a piece about it so that we don't neglect it in the Atlantic. What's missing from reports on Alabama's black turnout? Democratic Senate candidate Doug Jones will have to get significant numbers of black voters to the polls in order to win, but the state's voter suppression will make that a tough task. And it's been under-discussed, and I guess it would be foolish to note that it's been under-discussed and not discuss it and run away to another subject just on the hopes of shoehorning in more for your weekend reading. So let's not do that. Let's focus on what Van had to say. In order to understand democracy in the United States, he begins, take a moment to consider Alabama. In the good old heart of Dixie, the story of voting rights can be told just about from beginning to end. It was in towns and cities throughout the state where the civil rights movement fought most fiercely for the ballot, among other things, and where 52 years ago Martin Luther King led the famous march from Selma to Montgomery that helped push through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout the state, black people organized for decades in order to finally acquire that most Central American right, and they paid the price of the ticket in blood. And by the way, well worth noting the exchange on Twitter this morning and the note of the comments of the White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, excoriating none other than John Lewis for declining to appear with Donald Trump, noted civil rights activist, at the opening of the Civil Rights Museum, and excoriating him for not taking the time out of his busy schedule to recognize the importance of these civil rights leaders who worked so hard and paid with their blood to acquire and secure civil rights for all Americans, except, of course, that, well, John Lewis was one of those people that did that, and probably doesn't really need the museum to remind him. But apparently Sarah Huckabee Sanders not quite entirely aware of who she was talking about there, but I guess no surprise and no shock in finding that one out. But anyway, whatever. Anything for a cheap shot, I guess. All right, I'll have to find that tweet and make sure you have that on hand. Let's get in a little bit more of the story about Alabama here, yet as Alabama's story today tells. The Voting Rights Act was not ironclad. As the cornerstone of the movement for the franchise, Alabama has also played the part of headquarters of resistance. Not the good kind either. A long legal and legislative guerrilla war against voting rights that culminated in 2013's Shelby County versus Holder case, where one where officials in the Alabama county successfully sued for all of the former dominion of Jim Crow to be released from federal VRA oversight. That victory and the structural barriers to voting erected in its aftermath are a serious and largely unacknowledged impediment to Democrat Doug Jones's chances in the special election for the state's open Senate seat on Tuesday. In that race, Republican Roy Moore is running not only against Jones, but against a mountain of allegations of sexual assault and harassment of several teenagers. According to the most recent Washington Post Schar School polls, with renewed support from the national GOP, a presidential endorsement, and a powerful state machine behind him, Moore is keeping the race close, still only 3 points behind Doug Jones. A collection of other smaller polls actually show Moore pulling ahead in the last week. For Jones to win with such thin margins, he'll need to turn out black voters, but doing so will mean confronting the state's fraught history of voter suppression. Part of the story of the Alabama special election is how resilient Moore has been with white voters. The Washington Post Schar School polls show him retaining the support of 63% of likely white voters in the state, including 57% of white women. While these numbers show that the onslaught of allegations of crimes against women have hurt him somewhat, recently Republican presidential candidates in the state have garnered upwards of 70% of the white electorate. They also show that there appears to be nothing that can entirely stop the dominance of any GOP candidate with white Alabamians. Jones's path to victory is less complicated than before, but he still relies on the same dynamics as any Democrat in Alabama. As headline after headline attests, he'll likely have to see decent turnout among the 26% of voting-age citizens who are black and who largely live in the black belt of communities spanning the width of Alabama through the east and west of Montgomery. That's easier said than done. While Alabama did have the fifth highest black turnout of any state in the 2014 midterm elections, it's well known that black turnout in midterms is much lower generally than it is in presidential elections. And while special elections widely vary in terms of turnout and racial dynamics, the Alabama Secretary of State's office estimates that only about 1 million people overall will vote in Tuesday's election. That would be good for a paltry 26% overall. Predictions that would follow an incredibly low 14% turnout for the Republican primary runoff and speak to the general level of interest of the special election. They probably don't bode well for making big gains among black voters, and that's before we even get to the suppression that is the key to the balance of Van's article here, which we'll include for your perusal over the weekend. Yes, we've once again run up against our time limits here. We'll be back next week. Who knows what the weekend will bring us if nobody is on guard, keeping the phone out of Donald Trump's hands. Maybe he's dried it out in a jar of rice after dropping it in one of the golden toilets in the White House. Maybe someone's been withholding it from him all this time. This is when all hell usually breaks loose in Donald Trump's Twitter world, and I guess we need to be on the lookout. In the meantime, this isn't the end of the programming day here on Netroots Radio by no means, and anything we may have missed so far will no doubt be scooped up by Justice on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Coming up next, here's what we got for you on the show today. An update on the Los Angeles wildfires, of course, that have burned over 100 square miles. And then on the rest of the menu, investigating Mick Mulvaney considering a lower fine than the multi-million-dollar penalty the Consumer Bureau levied against Wells Fargo over illegal mortgage fees. The most hated restaurateur in America is hit with a lawsuit over wage theft just prior to opening a location in Trump's D.C. hotel. And the Export-Import Bank could vote as early as next week to make an anti-gay, anti-woman, anti-foreigner its new president. Moving on from there, a classic dish from history. Today, of course, is the 47th anniversary of John Lennon's murder, so we will listen to an appearance by John and Yoko Ono on the old Dick Cavett show from 1971.
From Daily Coos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
How's that for a wide net being cast on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, a specialty for Justice Putnam, and a great way to wind things up for the weekend and head into the Saturday and Sunday Twitter apocalypse yet to come. We'll be back on Monday with more.